Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Thursday, 18 July 2024. Today is the 102nd anniversary of the birth of Thomas Kuhn, who was born in Cincinnati on this day in 1922. Kuhn isn't remembered as a philosopher of history, but rather as a philosopher and an historian of science. However, if all histories embody some philosophy of history, whether or not this philosophy of history is made explicit, and this is an argument that has been made by Hayden White, among others, then Kuhn's history of science is at the same time a philosophy of history. We can find some hint of the philosophical problems of historiography in one of Kuhn's essays in his book, The Essential Tension, the first chapter of that book titled The Relations Between History and the Philosophy of Science. Quote, "During my days as a philosophically inclined physicist, my view of history resembled that of the covering law theorists, and the philosophers in my seminars usually began by viewing it in a similar way. What changed my mind often changes theirs, is the experience of putting together a historical narrative. That experience is vital, for the difference between learning history and doing it is far larger than that in most other creative fields, philosophy certainly included," unquote. Kuhn is here referring to Carl Hempel's covering law model of historical explanation, which was in the middle of the 20th century, the reigning analytical philosophy of history. Kuhn says that it was the experience of actually assembling an historical narrative that changed his view of the covering law model. Kuhn's conversion away from the covering law model employs a distinction between learning history and doing history and the gap between the two. So what exactly is doing history and how does it differ from learning history? Presumably, doing history would be writing history or teaching history. It could even mean studying history, though the latter would certainly also count as learning history. There is some ambiguity as to whether the study of a discipline is the same thing as learning it, or the same as doing it, or a bit of both. In the above, for Kuhn, doing history is putting together a historical narrative. In several episodes, I have remarked how much analytical philosophy of history was changed by the work of Arthur Danto, who made the logic of narrative sentences central to his analytical philosophy of history. But even before Danto, as with the case of Morton White, and independently of Danto, as with the case of Haskell Fane, others in the analytical philosophy community were beginning to converge on narrative as the essential feature of history. I would argue that this had to happen because one of the reasons that it has been argued that history is not a science and cannot be a science is that it is formulated in a prose narrative and not expressed in mathematical laws, as we might find in physics, for example. If analytical philosophy was to have its own philosophy of history, then someone had to offer a theory of the narrative structure of history. The alternative is to abandon history entirely, as in the Cartesian tradition, and to follow Quine's dictum that philosophy of science is philosophy enough. Not only does that impoverish philosophy, but it also leaves unanswered the status of valid claims of historical knowledge now utterly disconnected from science. Continuing the above quote from Kuhn, quote, "From it, I conclude, among other things, that an ability to predict the future is no part of the historian's arsenal. He is neither a social scientist nor a seer. It is no mere accident that he knows the end of his narrative as well as the start before he begins to write. History cannot be written without that information. Though I have no alternate philosophy of history or of historical explanation to offer here, I can at least outline a better image of the historian's task and suggest why its performance might produce a sort of understanding," unquote. Kuhn here explicitly disavows having formulated any philosophy of history. At the same time, he suggests that doing history may produce a sort of understanding. Is this the sort of understanding that we derive or which we hope to derive from a philosophy of history, or is it something entirely different? Is a philosophical understanding of history best to be had from putting together an historical narrative or critiquing how historians go about assembling an historical narrative? Is Kuhn's better image of the historian's task a source of this understanding? And what is Kuhn's image of the historian's task? In another essay from The Essential Tension, The Historical Structure of Scientific Discovery, Kuhn tells us that we need new terms and new concepts to do justice to this history of science. Quote, "We need a new vocabulary and new concepts for analyzing events like the discovery of oxygen. Though undoubtedly correct, the sentence oxygen was discovered misleads by suggesting that discovering something is a simple act unequivocally attributable, if only we knew enough, to an individual at an instant in time. When the discovery is unexpected, however, the latter attribution is always impossible, and the former often is as well. We can, for example, safely say that oxygen had not been discovered before 1774. Probably we could also insist that it had been discovered by 1777 or shortly thereafter. But within those limits, any attempt to date the discovery or to attribute it to an individual must inevitably be arbitrary," unquote. What exactly is going on here in this discussion of the discovery of oxygen? What motivates Kuhn's desire to show us the complexity behind what has often been considered to be a relatively straightforward question about the discovery of oxygen? Historians have reacted rather badly to criticism of past history of science as being an heroic narrative. The idea that Lavoisier discovered oxygen or that Newton discovered the laws of gravitation is considered problematic because a fine-grained account of scientific discovery is more complicated than that. Telling the story of the history of science as a narrative of great men like Lavoisier or Newton is now derided as scientific hagiography, as though the scientists' biographies were being written like saints' lives. In my previous episode on Walter Bonneman, I mentioned Nietzsche's three kinds of history: the monumental, the antiquarian, and the critical. Bonneman's history is critical, and he was especially critical of historicism, which I characterize as being something like, not perfectly like, but something like what Nietzsche called antiquarian history. Traditional history of science, by contrast, was monumental history, which meant building up great figures of science as models to emulate, heroes of science, as it were, to be revered and to be emulated. Kuhn was part of the reaction against this monumental history of science. In the previously quoted passage, Kuhn was effectively deconstructing the traditional narrative of the discovery of oxygen and showing how it might be credited not to Lavoisier, but to Carl Scheele or Joseph Priestley. Kuhn also discusses this example in greater depth and detail in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Continuing with the same quote, "Furthermore, it must be arbitrary just because discovering a new sort of phenomenon is necessarily a complex process which involves recognizing both that something is and what it is. Observation and conceptualization, fact and the assimilation of the fact to theory are inseparably linked in the discovery of scientific novelty. Inevitably, that process extends over time and may often involve a number of people. Only for discoveries in which my second category, those whose nature is known in advance, can discovering that and discovering what occur together and in an instant," unquote. This is, of course, true, and monumental histories of science give us a simplified version because the simplified version is the easy one to hold in your mind. We always understood that if we wanted to get the details, we would go to the monographic literature, and there we would find it spelled out for us in excruciating detail, and the detail of the kind of which most of us do not possess the patience, nor do we possess the memory to retain it after we've had the patience to read it through. Histories of science starting in the second half of the 20th century, wanted to put the details of the monographic literature front and center so that no one mistakes a complex problem for a simpler one. Kuhn is part of what we may then call the complexification of the history of science, not cutting corners and not making any concessions of convenience to the exposition. Kuhn is also part of the relativization of science and the history of science. This isn't unrelated to the rejection of a monumental history of science. Monumental histories of science not only give us larger than life heroes of science, they also give us an edifying ideal of scientific knowledge to which to aspire. That ideal, which is part of the positivist legacy, is that after humanity had been bumbling and fumbling around in the dark for millennia, finally modern science appeared, and for the first time in history, we had positive knowledge of the world. Not mere theological claims about the world that we got from religion from the earliest days of human societies, and not metaphysical claims about the world that we got from philosophy. Positive science finally gave us positive knowledge of the world, and this was a creed that could inspire further triumphs in scientific knowledge. It was a creed worth communicating in monumental histories of science. We could call this a gospel of positivism, and monumental histories of science gave us this gospel not only as a possession of the ages, but also that we might go out ourselves and do the good work of science. But when this 19th century doctrine of the positive knowledge of science was being formulated by Auguste Comte, there were already rumblings elsewhere of heresies against this gospel. The 19th century Russian philosopher Nikolai Danilevsky argued that different cultural historical types had different scientific traditions. In the early 20th century, Oswald Spengler went further than Danilevsky and argued that different civilizations had wholly different sciences that were effectively incommensurable. And incommensurability would be a term that would later become in wide use after Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolution. Later in the 20th century, Kuhn argued that different sciences belong not to different cultures or to different civilizations or different regions, but to different ages, to different periods in our history. These periods are separated by paradigm shifts in which our conception of what counts as evidence, what counts as a valid argument, and what phenomena we ought to account for in an explanation changes. Between these paradigm shifts, science kind of drifts downstreams without any great changes. Kuhn calls this normal science. The practice of normal science comes close to being what we have conventionally understood to be the history of science. It is slow and painstaking research that cumulatively builds up results. Kuhn called normal science an exercise in puzzle solving. So this is from The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Quote, bringing a normal research problem to a conclusion is achieving the anticipated in a new way, and it requires the solution of all sorts of complex instrumental, conceptual, and mathematical puzzles. The man who succeeds proves himself an expert puzzle solver, and the challenge of the puzzle is an important part of what usually drives him on, unquote. Normal science is also the elaboration of what Kuhn calls a paradigm. In the subsequent literature on Kuhn, the idea of a paradigm has been extremely influential, but it has also been controversial. Even philosophers and historians who liked Kuhn's book and wanted to extend his work were troubled by Kuhn's various uses of paradigm, which seemed to suggest different meanings in different contexts. So here's an exposition of paradigms from the very beginning of The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Quote, Aristotle's physics, Ptolemy's Almagest, Newton's Principia and optics, Franklin's electricity, Lavoisier's chemistry, and Laia's geology. These and many other works served for a time implicitly to define the legitimate problems and methods of a research field for succeeding generations of practitioners. They were able to do so because they shared two essential characteristics. Their achievement was sufficiently unprecedented to attract an enduring group of adherents away from competing modes of scientific activity. Simultaneously, it was sufficiently open-ended to leave all sorts of problems for the redefined group of practitioners to resolve, unquote. And then just below that, Kuhn goes on to call paradigms particular coherent traditions of scientific research. And then he names Ptolemaic astronomy, Copernican astronomy, Aristotelian dynamics, Newtonian dynamics, corpuscular optics, and wave optics. But a change in perspective can turn a puzzle and puzzle solving that we can try to conduct within the existing paradigm into a problem and a counterexample to the paradigm rather than a mere puzzle to be solved by the paradigm. And this is an anomaly. And as anomalies build up, it pushes the paradigm into what came to be called a model crisis. So Kuhn says that science without a paradigm isn't a science at all, so that a crisis for one paradigm becomes an opportunity for another paradigm. Quote, the decision to reject one paradigm is always simultaneously the decision to accept another, and the judgment leading to that decision involves a comparison of both paradigms with nature and with each other, unquote. Thus, we arrive at the famous paradigm shift, which found its way into popular culture not long after Kuhn formulated the idea. Paradigm change then makes it possible for us to go back to the workaday business of normal science, and except that now we are elaborating a new paradigm instead of the old, now abandoned paradigm. This sequence of steps in the history of science is now called the Kuhn cycle. Since Kuhn has been so influential, the idea of the Kuhn cycle has been taken over by any number of expositors and commentators who have smoothed over the rough spots and made the sequence more schematic and perhaps even more coherent. In its most schematic form, the Kuhn cycle has been glossed as consisting of normal science, model drift, model crisis, model revolution, paradigm change, and then back to normal science. The Kuhn cycle is an example of a speculative philosophy of the history of science. The idea of a speculative philosophy of the history of science is an idea I got from Haskell Fane. In my episode on Haskell Fane, I quoted from Fane in his 1970 book, Between Philosophy and History, The Resurrection of Speculative Philosophy of History Within the Analytical Tradition. And from Fane, quote, what positivism lacked, I contend, was a penetrating speculative philosophy of the history of science, the encouragement to fashion storylines upon which better histories of science could be constructed. Just as there is more to history than orthodox political history, so there is more to speculative philosophy of history than Hegel's philosophy of history, which is essentially a speculative philosophy of political history. Each kind of history requires its own kind of speculative philosophy of history, unquote. This appeared in the same year as the second edition of Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Kuhn is mentioned in Fane's suggestions for further reading, but Kuhn's work is not discussed in the book. A reductionist account of Kuhn's philosophy is that scientific progress is not cumulative, but proceeds in fits and starts with many losses along the way. And there is an ongoing debate among Kuhn's heirs as to whether theory change in science is ultimately a rational process, even if it isn't linear, or if it is ultimately an irrational process, essentially arbitrary and without deeper meaning or coherent directionality. Another way to put this, and perhaps a more tendentious way to put it, is that Kuhn was denying that there is progress in science. As we've seen in many episodes, progress has been a particular point of contention in modern history. Condorcet's Enlightenment history of human thought was entirely constructed around the progress of the human mind. During the 20th century, however, The idea of progress came under sustained attack until no one dared to even suggest that progress of any kind characterizes history. So not only is Kuhn part of the critique of the monumental history of science and part of the relativization of scientific knowledge, such as seen earlier in Danilevsky and Spengler, Kuhn was also a part of the critique of progress. So although Kuhn's work came as a great shock to many when it was published, especially to historians of science, we can see that the shock value of Kuhn's philosophy consisted not in saying what had never been said before, but in making these ideas fully explicit and offering detailed historical and philosophical arguments for his positions. On the last page of the book, Kuhn places his work in the context of some of the larger questions that it engages, and some of which he suggests are partially resolved by this approach, and some of which remain open. Quote, "What must nature, including man, be like in order that science be possible at all? Why should scientific communities be able to reach a firm consensus unattainable in other fields? Why should consensus endure across one paradigm change after another? And why should paradigm change inevitably produce an instrument more perfect in any sense than those known before? From one point of view, these questions, excepting the first, have already been answered. But from another, they are as open as they were when this essay began. It is not only the scientific community that must be special. The world of which that community is part must also possess quite special characteristics, and we are no closer now than we were at the start to knowing what these must be," unquote. So Kuhn leaves us with a very open-ended conclusion, and even those who accept his innovations in the history of science have before them the task of answering these questions from the point of view from which they remain unanswered. This isn't actually how Kuhn's scholarship has developed since the book was published, but it remains open as a potential avenue of contribution for anybody who wanted to take up the burden where Kuhn laid it down. So happy birthday, Thomas Kuhn, and thanks for listening.